Good morning, everybody. This talk derives from Spotlight, which I used to give when we were volunteering at Kenwood, especially in the music room. And it's inspired by two paintings which used to hang opposite each other in the music room at Kenwood. There we have it. One of them on the right is now in the breakfast room as part of the Pictures of Innocence, Children and Animals in Georgian Art theme. We could have probably put the other one in as well, because we've got the children and we've got pets as well, but there we go. The one on the left shows the two small boys playing with a little dog. The boys still dressed in petticoats prior to being breeched. This is a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And there's one of Sir Joshua's trademarks, the little dog, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. He appears in a number of other paintings. There's another painting in the music room of the Angerstein children, which shows the same dog. So he was obviously a prop that Reynolds used when he was painting children, which he did frequently and which he enjoyed very much. The other painting, a little girl holding a kitten, painted by Thomas Gainsborough, the other great artist of the late 18th century. Gainsborough, unlike Reynolds, didn't paint many children. There is, of course, that famous painting of the Blue Boy by Gainsborough, which is, I think, hanging in a museum in Malibu in California. But on the whole, he didn't paint children, and so that's the Gainsborough. At least we think it's the Gainsborough, and that's what the Kenwood catalogue says, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Oh, what is that? 10 Downing Street? What has that got to do with my story? Well, as you well know, it's been the residence of British Prime Ministers since the time of Sir Robert Walpole. But why is it here? Because it was the home at that time of William Brummell Sr. William Brummell was a man of humble origin. His father was a butler in a stately home, but William wanted to better himself, and he got some education and managed to get a job as a secretary in the Treasury. When he was there, he attracted the attention of Lord North, Prime Minister of England from 1770 to 1782. And he was acting as Lord North's assistant at the time of the birth of his youngest son, George Brian Brummell, otherwise known to us all as Beau Brummell. Next slide, please. There's a picture of Lord North by our friend, Mr. Pompeo Batoni, who some of us will recognize from the painting by him of Mrs. Sandilands in the breakfast room at Kenwood. Now, Lord North, of course, was Prime Minister at the time of the American Revolution, and he was blamed by George III as being responsible for the loss of the American colonies. Brummel, who was working for Lord North at the time, managed to better himself, and his involvement meant that he could acquire all sorts of perks and benefits, many more so perhaps in the 18th century than today. Well, maybe not, who knows? But anyway, he used his enhanced status to marry Jane Richardson, who was the daughter of a very senior civil servant, the keeper of the lottery office. And when he married her, he acquired some substantial capital, which she brought with her as her dowry. Now, because of his senior position in Downing Street, Brummel was able to obtain a number of sinecures, as well as dispensing favors, for which he no doubt received financial benefit. Suffice it to say that by the time of Lord North's retirement as Prime Minister, Brummel was also able to retire and purchase a substantial property near Newbury in Berkshire. Thus, he was able to settle down to life as a country squire. He and his wife had 3 children. Maria, born in 1771, the little girl whose portrait we saw before, William in 1776, and George in 1778, the 2 little boys pre-breached. Because of his enhanced status and his political connections, William was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Berkshire, a very exalted position, in fact, the Queen's representative in Berkshire. So he'd come a long way from the humble position of his birth in the servants' quarters of a stately home. Now, perhaps to demonstrate his enhanced status as a country gentleman of means, Brummel commissioned the best artists in the land to paint portraits of his 3 children. The boys were painted by Reynolds in 1781, when they were aged 5 and 3 respectively, and Maria was painted by Thomas Gainsborough in 1782 or 3, when she was 11 or 12. And both paintings were displayed in public for the first time at the Royal Academy in 1783. Brummel's wife died in 1793, and William made a new will, dividing his assets among his 3 children upon their each reaching the age of 21. William himself died only a year later, leaving a fortune of some £65,000. Not much, you may think, but of course, equivalent in 18th century terms to some £7.5 million in purchasing power. Maria stayed with her father until his death, and after she attained her majority and came into her inheritance, she married an army officer, a Captain Blackshaw, purchased a property in Berkshire, and had 2 daughters. They in time grew up and married foreign nobility, becoming Baron de Maltzahn and Countess Lenowska respectively, a far cry from their humble forebears. She stayed at home, but as was typical of the time, I suppose, the boys were given a proper education. Again, through the Lord North connection, both boys went to Eton. William passed through school without any particular impact, but when George followed, he became an immediate hit, acquiring the nickname Buck Brummell. He was very popular at school, and he met another boy there who became his best friend, who was also called George. But he was the eldest son of King George III and the heir to the throne. We always knew there were advantages of going to Eton, didn't we? I shall refer to that George as Prince George, and his friendship with Brummel was very important to the latter throughout his career. The friendship continued when both brothers went up to Oxford and became members of Oriel College. Well, that's now in the news because of the generous support given by one of its benefactors, a certain Cecil Rhodes, whose statue you can see above the entrance. There he is, causing all sorts of ructions nowadays. I think he's still there, although secured and protected by ropes. William dutifully took his degree at Oxford, and after graduating and coming into his inheritance, he purchased an estate in Wivenhoe in Essex. He married and settled down to life as a country squire, following in his father's footsteps, and having little to do with his wayward brother. William died in 1853, and we know very little more about him. George, however, didn't take to university life and left Oxford without taking a degree. Instead, he went into the army in 1794, joining the 10th Hussars, which just happened to be Prince George's regiment. It was there that he acquired his taste for fine clothing, and his nickname changed from Buck to Beau. An officer of the 10th Hussars at about the time when Beau Brummell was a very junior officer. And you can see these magnificent uniforms, which he did something to adjust and change the design. They had to buy their own uniform, so it was just quite an expensive process being an officer in the Hussars. Anyway, he enjoyed himself there enormously, enhanced his reputation as a beau and a buck. But after 4 years, at a time when it seemed that England was going to war with France, and upon coming into his share of his father's legacy at the age of 21, Beau took rooms in Chesterfield Street, Mayfair, and established himself as a rich and charming man about town, complete with servants, and he acquired the services nearby of his tailors, hatters, bootmakers, and shirtmakers, many of whose names can still be found around Curzon Street, St. James, and Jermyn Street. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Beau Brummell in his prime. What a handsome young fellow he is, and what a life he must have led. He would rise at noon, lunch at his club, spend the afternoon at cards, and the evenings at some of the more alluring establishments in Shepherd Market, Mayfair. He developed his taste for fashion, designing variations on existing styles and coming up with new ideas that he developed with the shops where he was a favored customer. Next slide. There he is in his prime, wearing new fashion items. And whenever he came up with some new item, whether it was a cravat or a waistcoat or a new way of cutting breeches or whatever it was, his friend Prince George would slavishly copy it and order dozens of each item. Although Beau had the benefit of the substantial fortune that his father had left him, he was able to go through the money at a fast rate. Most of his society companions were landed gentry and had continuing incomes, but George just had his capital, which he was rapidly diminishing. His friend Prince George was as profligate as Beau Brummell, and his taste for fine food and wine had the inevitable effect. Next slide, please. There we see Prince George in his prime. In fact, this is a painting by Henry Pierce Bone, taken just before his coronation in 1820. But in fact, the reality is somewhat different. Next slide, please. There we have him. There's Prince George at his cups, and you can see that it's had a rather bad effect on his waistline. Beau's lifestyle was catching up with him, and he began to borrow, firstly from his wealthy friends, but then from professional moneylenders who weren't quite so understanding if Beau failed to repay the loans on time. Worse, Beau fell out with Prince George. An incident occurred in about 1813 at a ball where the prince, who'd recently been appointed Prince Regent, saw Beau and ignored him. Beau was heard to inquire in a stage whisper to a colleague, "Who's your fat friend?" Prince George heard the remark, very offended, and cut Beau dead. Next slide, please. The incident was so well known that it became the subject of a cartoon, which you can see there. Who is your fat friend? There he is, looking at Prince George, who actually looks quite slim and elegant there, but perhaps the reality was more like the slide that we saw earlier. The incident had a disastrous effect on Beau's status and on his credit. The moneylenders closed in, and Beau faced the threat of debtors' prison if he didn't pay. Debtors' prison. What a ghastly place. This was a very serious threat because unlike a normal prison sentence, when you might be incarcerated for 3 or 6 or 12 months, depending on your crime, but you stayed until the sentence expired and you went free. In debtor's prison, you stayed there until the debt was paid. Some of you may have read Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, where the heroine's father is incarcerated in the Marshalsea prison for many years with little hope of freedom. You may also recall that 2 of Kenwood's female subjects, Dorothea Jordan and Emma Hamilton, were faced with the same prospect, and they escaped to France to avoid debtor's prison. And Beau Brummell did the same. He was forced to leave England, to leave his lovely lodgings in Mayfair, and he went to Caen, C-A-E-N, in northern France, where his friends managed to secure a modest job for him as a British consul in the town. He carried on living in France in very much more straitened circumstances, but he was in debt, and eventually the consul position was terminated by the Foreign Office, and his small salary stopped. Beau's debts increased, and he did indeed go to prison in France, where he was incarcerated for some 6 months. Whether it was any worse than the Marshalsea, I don't know, but it wasn't very nice. By this time, Beau had lost all his allure and presented a sad picture of himself in middle age. Next slide, please. There you see him walking through the streets of Caen, wrapped up against the cold. Somebody wrote of him this following verse: "Keen blows the wind and piercing is the cold. My pins are weak and I am growing old. Alas, alas, which wind and rain do beat, that great Beau Brummell should so walk the street." He was sprung from the French prison because his friends in England prevailed upon Lord Palmerston to vote a compensatory payment to him for the loss of his job as consul, which fortunately managed to meet the debts and got him released. Apart from his money worries, he had problems of a more distressing nature. His life of debauchery caught up with him, and having first contracted syphilis in the brothels of Mayfair, and he's in his 20s, his condition got worse, and by the time he was in France, he was diagnosed with 3rd stage venereal disease. The treatments for this condition were often worse than the disease itself, and Beau endured all the horrors that the doctors could assail him with. Mercury treatments robbed him of his teeth and his hair. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Beau towards the end of his life. The luxuriant growth of hair is a wig, and as you can see from his mouth, he's lost all his teeth. The description of the physical deterioration of people with 3rd stage syphilis is quite sickening and horrible, and Beau's final years must have been pretty awful. He was eventually confined to an asylum where he died in 1840, a pauper who didn't even merit a mention in the English press. However, his reputation did survive, and after his death, books and articles began to appear in England about his life and his style. His ideas about morning and evening dress were still followed, including the use of black and somber colours in place of the gaudy male dress of the late 18th century. Next slide, please. There we see a picture taken somewhat later, but nonetheless, the styles, which you see there illustrated towards the end of the 19th century, are typical of the ideas that Beau Brummell introduced. Next slide, please. In 1954, a terrible Hollywood-style movie was made entitled Beau Brummell and the Beauty, featuring Stuart Granger, who some of you may remember, as the Beau, and Elizabeth Taylor as Lady Patricia Bellam, a fictitious female aristocrat allegedly in love with Beau Brummell. The only good thing in the movie is a cameo of Peter Ustinov as the Prince Regent, who storms out of the room following the fat friend inquiry, but years later visits Beau on his deathbed in France. Chronologically, that's impossible because Prince George, or King George IV as he became, he died in 1829, I think it was, about 10 years before Beau Brummell. A final, more fitting memorial was produced as recently as the year 2000, when a group of Piccadilly retailers got together and commissioned a full-length bronze statue of Beau walking along Jermyn Street, immaculately turned out as the dandy that he always was. Next slide, please. There we see him in his prime, in his milieu, with all those nice menswear stores still functioning behind him. That's really all I wanted to say about the Brummells, except for this. Next slide, please. The painting of Maria Brummell. Hugh Belsey, who was director of Gainsborough House in Sudbury and an acknowledged expert on Gainsborough, has determined that the painting is not by the master, but by his nephew, Gainsborough Dupont, who worked with him in his later years. In an article which appeared in the Guardian newspaper in March of 2017, he stated that it's just not Gainsborough's style. It's too messy. It lacks confidence. The handling is rather scratchy in comparison with the real Gainsborough. To talk about style and confidence is hardly an objective assessment in dismissing a work which was sold to Lord Ivy over 100 years ago as an authentic Gainsborough, and to have been so described in the Kenwood catalogue without qualification. However, that opinion has made some impression since the painting now hanging in the breakfast room at Kenwood has a new description card, which states that it's by, quote, Gainsborough and Gainsborough Dupont. My own view is that William Brummell père, a self-made man who rose to become Lord Lieutenant of his county, would not have tolerated having his daughter's portrait painted by an apprentice when his sons sat for the great Sir Joshua. Or maybe he did. Thank you.